I'm going to get us started here. So this is a Portland Psychedelic Society event. The title had integration in the name of this talk, but today's talk is that. It is not an integration circle. We're not here to share. We are here to watch Larry give us a presentation about integration, the meaning of meaning making. I was able to watch Larry give a presentation at the Detroit Psychedelic Conference about not just integration, but a variety of glossary words that we use at these meetings all of the time, and it really helped me parse everything out and explain things a lot better than I had, the concepts I had just from communicating with everybody else. So I'm really looking forward to this talk, which is going to be packed with, as Larry has promised, a lot of theory. And Larry, if you don't know, let me give you a short bio of Larry. He is from Oakland, California, and he is with a group called the Entheogenic Research, Integration, and Education. They are a 501c3 similar to Portland Psychedelic Society and focused on education. They have integration models, they have integration circles, and from there, Larry has also formed Decriminalize Nature, which we've learned about that a couple weeks ago, which has made it decriminalized for you to grow and give away entheogenic plants and substances. Sorry, I don't know what word we're using there. And so I'm really looking forward to this talk. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Larry to share his screen. And if you have any questions for this, just go ahead and post them in the chat. And if you want to join in with questions, please raise your hand. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. Hello, everybody. It's pretty exciting to be here. This is actually one of the first few times that I've presented my dissertation, because I just, this is partially my dissertation, so maybe that's where the theory comes in, and also practical application. But I just graduated this spring, and we had sort of an anticlimactic graduation ceremony where it was just my name on the screen for a half second and then onto the text. So all that work. But today, and this is why I know theory is a good day, because my dissertation just came in the mail, and here it is in hard book format. So I'm pretty excited about that. So that's how I knew today I could bring in as much goodness as I could, because the dissertation and the USPS is on our side today. So that's great. Okay, so I'm still kind of figuring out how to do share screen here, so excuse me while I jumble around on this real quick here. Don't mind that little cartoon there. Gotta have some fun cartoons. Okay, so I'm not gonna be able to see everyone's comments, but if you do have any comments at all, you can go ahead and ask them in the comment section, and then when this is all over, I can go ahead and go through them and we can have a little discussion. I figure the talk will take about 45 minutes total, just going over this process, and then afterwards we can have about however long a discussion, give an opportunity for people to take a break and listen a little deeper. Oops, I don't know how do I get the little screen box off of, I guess I don't have to, huh? Okay, so can you see the screen without our faces on the side of it, or no?
Yeah, we see I'm speaking now. We see your face, whoever's speaking, and then we see the thing. We don't see everybody.
So it's not cutting off half of the, okay, perfect.
It looks good.
Great, okay, so today's talk is going to be called Integration, which is basically the meaning of meaning making. I saw the poll that was in there, and it seems like most people here, or a good majority of people that had answered the poll, had understood what the definition of integration was. But I came to the realization in my dissertation process that even scholars don't agree upon what the definition of integration was. So hopefully we'll learn some new definitions or some broadening of our understandings of this, and including myself, as we kind of learn together. And that's the beautiful thing about this area. It's been talked about a lot, but really kind of in a new field in terms of how to sort of relate to these experiences. So my name's Larry Norris. Like I said, I just got my doctorate this spring, and also I am co-founder of Entheogenic Research, Integration, Education, as Jason mentioned. We do integration and education circles. We've been doing pure integration circles since co-founder of 2011 out here in the Bay Area. I also co-founded Decriminalize Nature, as Jason mentioned, which is working across the U.S. to help decriminalize entheogenic plants and fungi. Also want to say thank you to everybody here. Thank you, Portland Psychedelic Society. Thank you, Jason. This is amazing. I'm really excited to be able to share this information, especially now in our virtual days where we can share from a lot farther distance away. So before I kind of jump into this, I want to give a little bit of a perspective of kind of how I came to this work, because, some people come to this work through books, or some people come to this work through, experiences with others, those types of things. And my kind of realization came through experiences. So I realized after having some pretty profound experiences that there just wasn't a real good space for being able to talk about what just happened. Right. And so the first experience that I can think of that was really sort of shocking to me, and I was really lucky when I started having entheogenic experiences. I met a next door neighbor. Her name was Phoenix, so appropriate name for this type of work, right? And she really taught me right from the beginning, you close your eyes, you do a high dose, you turn the lights off, you don't listen to any music, you just kind of go inwards. So that was kind of my starting with this. A little bit further on, maybe a couple years after that, I had one of the experiences that really kind of like shocked me into the understanding of why we need meaning making. And this experience, I'll give you a little bit of a background on it. I had, and I'm sure you probably all had the experience where, you eat a bunch of mushrooms and you're like, oh, maybe these aren't working. And so you eat a bunch more and you're like, oh, maybe these aren't working. And so by the time I was done, I'd probably eaten about 7 grams. I kind of figured, okay, the day's over, nothing's going to happen. I started smoking some cannabis, listening to a little music, and I started watching this candle in the corner of the room. And this candle was kind of flickering, right? And I was telling this in the Detroit conference as well. It's kind of flickering back and forth and back and forth. And in my head, I was like, wow, let me see if I can get into the rhythm of the candle. This is really interesting, right? And so as this rhythm of the candle was going, I thought in my head, I wonder if I can make the candle go out. And as soon as the word out went out of my head, the candle flame went out. Now, I've thought about this a million times. It could have been the wind. It could have been whatever. It didn't really matter, because at that moment, it was the shock of the candle going out that allowed me to then experience what I was looking for, because I was like, how when you're so busy looking for your experience that you kind of miss it. And then all of a sudden, boom, this huge experience just creeps in. And it was like waves and waves and like files of like information, this like sort of transcendent, this sort of weird symbolic information. And I was kind of reading it by just moving my head back and forth through it. And it was just really profound to me, because it felt like really in-depth information, like symbols and things like that, but it didn't really mean anything, but it felt fulfilling and nourishing, right? And so this whole kind of, evening was about these sort of insights I was gaining from this sort of space that I was in. And when the experience was over, it was like 3-4 in the morning. And I ended up walking around Ann Arbor for a couple hours just looking for somebody to talk to, because I was like, what just happened? I had no idea that was even possible. At the time, I was studying neuroscience at University of Michigan, so it was so drastically different from the neuroscience I was learning, because they don't talk about consciousness like this at all. So it really kind of blew my mind. It was a huge paradigm shift for me. And so that was really sort of the first step that got me into this process of integration. Since then, I've explored with ayahuasca a bunch, DMT, a bunch of other things. I kind of believe for myself, at least, if I'm going to help someone with integration, I have to at least have had an experience with that medicine. So I don't feel as confident helping somebody with an Iboga experience, for example, because I haven't had Iboga yet, but I do feel more confident with ayahuasca or DMT or mushrooms or those types of things. So something to consider as you're working, if you're working with facilitation with people. So the general overview of this talk is basically going to be 2 different parts, which I'll go into the roadmap in a second. The first part is basically going to be theory. Like I said, that's going to be based on my dissertation work. And the second part of the talk is going to be on practical stuff. How do you create an integration circle? What are the considerations? How do you sort of set up the circle? All that kind of thing. Oop. All right, so here's the general roadmap for today. First, we're going to talk about sort of my observations on integration, which led me to this research. Then I'm going to kind of talk about why this is important in terms of the approach and the paradigms that we're talking about. And then I'm going to kind of break down a couple key terms. As I mentioned earlier, there's a bunch of people that said they were 100% sure what integration meant. And I think that maybe hopefully after this conversation will be a little bit, because I also was 100% sure until I started reading my dissertation research and was like, oh, wow, there's more here. So really, what is integration and what is implementation? Are they the same? Are they different? That type of thing. What is transformation? What is transformative? What is that kind of dynamic? That's another key term we'll look at. This idea of sudden change. How do you sort of qualify a sudden change experience? And if you have a sudden change experience, does it suggests that there's long-term potential for transformation, for behavioral change, these types of things. So that's kind of what this area here is, and we'll look at that in a little bit, called quantum change. Then we'll look at some archetypes of transformation that I found in my research. There's quite a few more, of course, than the ones I found here, but archetypes of transformation are basically thematically similar experiences, that have certain qualities that kind of go across the board here. Then we'll look at some integration indicators, some ideas for where the juicy spots are for your integration process. And then I want to touch on this really interesting experience that I noted in my dissertation called the soul home. And it kind of flips the whole idea of integration on its head a little bit, because it sort of assumes that this reality is the illusion and where our soul lives is the real spot. So how do we integrate with that process, right? Then we'll go into a little chart here on assimilation, accommodation, transformation, and beyond. This chart here will kind of look at the different approaches and the paradigms that we're trying to deal with, and maybe which skill set is best for which area. And then we'll go into the integration and practice part. So like I said, I'm going to be a little nerdy today, so I hope you don't mind if I do that, but I think that it'll be beneficial in terms of helping to understand the theory that's going on behind some of the stuff that we're talking about here. So from my oh, there we go. I was able to put all of our faces on the bottom for me, that make sure I don't take off half the slideshow here. So some observations I had in integration. This side here are observations I've had from hosting peer integration circles for the last 9 years. What I've noticed is that when people ask about integration, sometimes I know I need to integrate something, but I don't know what I need to integrate, what material needs to be integrated, where to even begin, where do I start, right? How do I even start this process? Totally lost. People, just something big happened and they don't know how to sort of digest it, right? Oftentimes what will happen is then these folks will go into like these ineffable spaces, which are really interesting because, they're trying to find language and words to kind of put on it. But at the same time, it's a bit of an eddy. It can get people off of the thread. It can get people off from remembering their key moments. So how do we sort of help people back on track so they can sort of follow along and get more information out from their experience? And then finally, I noticed that a lot of people would try to apply their insights before they fully understood them. So for a good example of this would be like, oh, I had this insight, I need to quit my job. And they go the next day and they quit their job. And then they reflect a little bit more. It's like, oh, maybe I just needed to work 5 days a week instead of 7. Or maybe I need to talk to my boss about being a little more lenient about this, that, and the other. And so you don't want to sometimes just go ahead and implement before you fully integrate it. And that's sort of where that dynamic was I was speaking to earlier between the two words. We also have sort of this observations on current approaches to integration. So this is sort of personal experience. And this is experience in terms of academia, in terms of the scholarly literature, in terms of who's doing the research or doing the work. So some observations I had that showed that really needed to be unpacked a little bit more. The first one is that oftentimes we have some therapists. I can speak to one specifically. I think he's great and all that, but I think that his integration circle was a little directive, and this would be like Arbor Mate style. So he has a much more directive integration. Like he kind of knows what he wants to hear before you even know what you want to hear, which from the process of like integration, that can be kind of tricky because it's like he's trying to go somewhere and maybe that's not where you want to go. I sort of, as a nature metaphor, it's like pulling the flowers of the petals out to make it bloom faster. Hold on, it's got its pace. Let's go from there, right? So how do we sort of avoid this directive approach and really allow for an organic emergence approach? I noticed that there's a lot of conflicting descriptions in the literature. Some people were talking about integration means you assimilate it back into your previous worldview. Some say accommodate it, some say transform it. And each of those are specifically different. So depending upon whose worldview you're speaking to and which place you're coming from, those 3 words can make a dramatic difference in terms of how you make meaning of the experience. So that was something that I really wanted to focus on. As I said, kind of here, there's a tendency to merge the two, integration with implementation. ERIE has done this as well on our website. We put this in 2015. We said integration is the application of insights into daily life. I would now say integration and implementation are the application of the insights into daily life. And then integration I would redefine as meaning making, and implementation is application. So we kind of had that space between the two. We sort of teased them out a little bit. I noticed that there, at least in the literature and the New York, NYU and Johns Hopkins literature, there's kind of this lack of understanding of the range of possible experiences, If you read the research, it's mostly talking about a mystical experience, which suggests a unitive mystical experience. They're using W.T. Stace's model. That model suggests positive, blissful, everything's connected, everything's unified. But there's a lot of other experiences that aren't that. So I noticed that people that were coming in and talking about integration is like, well, I had this like kind of death and dismemberment experience, but everyone's telling me it was supposed to be positive and blissful. And there's kind of the shame to share, like, did I do something wrong? Like, what was going on here? Why is my experience not positive like everyone else's? And so this was something I noticed I needed to sort of be unpacked to see, like, was it possible there are more experiences than just the unitive mystical? And then the last one here is kind of looking at sort of the lack of a paradigmatic framework that's informed by personal experiences. So typical, stuff that's happening in sort of clinical or sort of neuroscience doesn't really allow for the exploration of what the sacred is or what the spiritual is or these other kind of things. And unless the person's actually had a personal experience, it's really hard for that person to kind of step out of that system and see that there's more to the experience than we're just seeing when they initially go. So the next one here, we're going to talk about why this is important. So I believe that it's important to have this bottom-up approach to avoid these dominant paradigmatic lenses, which could influence or devalue an experience. So for example, if you're an atheist and you're helping facilitate, somebody had a spiritual experience, if you're trying to assimilate that back into your previous worldview, right, meaning you're not expanding it all, just breaking it down back into the previous worldview, you might say things like, oh, well, that was neurochemical imbalance, that was an optical illusion, that was, whatever. But it doesn't really speak to, oh, well, that was sacred, that was spiritual, these other kind of things. Same thing with this next one here, consciousness inside or outside of the brain. A neuroscientist believes that the consciousness is inside of our brain. Some of these experiences suggest the consciousness is outside of our brain and we're just kind of swimming in it. So if you're working with a facilitator who's doing integration that believes that, and you have an experience that's outside of that, it's kind of, makes things, devalues things, it kind of influences it, it makes it so that you can't really get to your own personal meaning. And that's what's really important here. As I mentioned a couple minutes ago too, we had this unitive, mystical, and transpersonal ordeal. So I call this an ordeal. This would be like where the death and dismemberment or the torture experience or, an upgrade or surgery or some of the other things that are happening in ayahuasca occur versus a pleasant, blissful, heavenly, type of experience. So both of those have their own meaning, and to sort of lump them all into this category can be troubling for folks. And so that's what I'm really speaking to here is like, what is the importance of considering who's helping to plant the seeds in the newly tilled soil of consciousness? So if you're working within a paradigm where people are maybe a little bit more mechanistic in their framework, is that where you want to go? If you're working in a paradigm where people are maybe a little bit more, commercialization or, however our world is that going to help when you have this profound experience of connection and heartfelt love and abundance and all these types of things? So who's sort of helping you as you make meaning is really big here. And I think this is a conversation we're trying to have across the US too with Decriminalize Nature and everything else, how important it is to have culturally relevant sitters, facilitators, people who are experientially aligned, that understand what's going on, that understand the history of the individual, because then they can help meaning emerge versus directively adding meaning into the brain, that type of thing, or the mind. So here we're going to go over a couple brief overview of some key terms. This is for my dissertation. There's a lot of stuff here. I'm guessing most people know Westerner was just kind of industrialized in the sort of modern world. Ayahuasca is this is a flower of ayahuasca right here, actually, Banisteriopsis caapi, and so Psychotria viridis, put together in a brew, and it creates an orally active DMT. Here's the really interesting part where I was mentioning earlier, and I'll talk about this more in the next slide, is this idea of transformative, which would be like a short term, and transformation, which suggests a long-term transformation, long-term behavioral change. As I mentioned earlier, we have this sort of separation between integration as meaning making and implementation as the application into daily life. Beyond this, even, we could go with community implementation or community integration, which then takes it from here back into the community in a sense of reciprocity or service. So that's what we're kind of looking at there. I'd be curious to see any questions at the end if your definitions of integration have changed or think differently according to how this looks here. Integration cues and the study that I was looking at were both like activities and practices that people had, that insights they had, things that, that were, oh yeah, I need to do this thing. So those were in the database that I looked at. And with all this, fully immersive visions, quantum change, archetypes, transformation, et cetera, we have these pre-strategy integration framework. So I sort of posit or sort of argue that these are the important qualities to figure out before you even begin the meaning making process. Otherwise, you're starting at a point where you're just struggling trying to remember what it is. So to really go through and sort of suss out what all these different things are, and then you can go through meaning making. As I said earlier, archetypes of transformation are themes, similar themes of transformation. So death and rebirth experience, kundalini activation, unitive mystical experience, those types of things. Quantum change is the sudden shift. And then this one here is really fascinating because, again, it touches on what, if we don't understand the paradigm that people are coming from, it's really hard to really understand how to help make meaning. So what's the difference between a vision and a fully immersive experience? So a vision you see in front of you, you participate in, it's like a movie. It's there, but it's not totally there, right? And a fully immersive experience is where you're in the space, things are moving, there's active interaction, and entities maybe doing some weird stuff to you or whatever, you're moving through the fabric of the world, all these kind of things are happening, but that really questions what is the nature of reality, right? And we're stuck in a reality where it's very much mechanistic. So when these types of experiences happen, it can be a total paradigm shift altogether in terms of how we understand the world, how we understand consciousness, how we understand the cosmovision, etc. So I'm gonna play this little clip here right now so you can hear it. You might want to turn your volume up.
It was awe-inspiring, and then I couldn't call this vision. It was something else. It was fabric, reality.
So I guess I should mention, I forgot to mention this part. All this is coming from a database of experiences that were recorded 12 to 15 hours after ayahuasca. So this is the next day around noon or so. And this is a sharing circle. People just shared kind of what their experiences were about, what was interesting to them, what was relevant. And that's kind of what I pulled from this. But that was sort of a comment that one of the people had around their experience. Again, not a vision, but this sort of fabric of reality. So for me, I started off talking about it as visions. And by the time I got done, I had to change it to be fully immersive experience because it wasn't really a vision in that same sort of sense that we're talking about. And because we're talking about meaning making, to be really accurate with the words we're using, I think is really critical, especially for people helping with this facilitation process. So here, I was really ambitious and did my entire dissertation in one page. So there it is. Done. So basically, I'm not going to talk about this right now at this point, but what I'm going to talk about here is a little bit more about transformation and the types of transformation, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to integrate is this transformative moment, right? So what is transformation? We have gradual transformation, we have sudden transformation. Let's just say here we have our fully immersive experience, we have our potential transformative impact. Let's say this is something where our ayahuasca experience is like, hey, you've been a little chubby because it's, it's Corona, you need to do more exercise and eat more healthy food. Okay, so that's a pretty clear insight. I can just do that. I can, do some practice, some discipline, reflection over time. And then eventually we'll get to some long-term observable change. Like I'll be a little healthier, I'll have more exercise, those types of things. So this is interesting, but in terms of what I was looking at, it wasn't something I wanted to focus on. I was actually much more curious about this sudden idea, right? What happens in a real quick, sudden couple hours, 20 minutes, a moment which feels like infinity, but it's happening in under 5 hours. Can that still have a transformational impact? Can that still have long-term transformation? And so that's kind of what I was exploring in my dissertation here. So can it have a sudden impact? I was like, how in the world can I figure out and qualify whether or not a sudden shift can have a long-term impact? Because I'm working with a database of experiences, but I don't, because of the way the methodology was set up, I wasn't having an opportunity to go back and check in with everybody afterwards to see, you said this, 10 years ago, do you still feel that that's the case today, right? So I was looking for some theories that would really kind of help unpack this. And there's this idea in Rachel Harris's book, Listening to Ayahuasca, I believe it's called. And she talks about quantum change indicators. And quantum, not as in like quantum physics, but quantum as in like sudden and unexpected, that type of thing. And the 4 different qualities we have there are vivid, benevolence, surprise, and enduring. And I'll talk about these a little bit more on the next slide. But the most important thing is the endurance. They found in their studies that if somebody had these qualities of an experience, they still remembered it 10, 20 years later. Now, remembering it is one thing because that suggests there's a long-term impact. Even if there isn't a long-term transformational observable change, there is going to be a long-term impact, right? Because that person's still remembering, it's still on their head. They're still, it's really clear to them, right? What's also really, really fascinating about this is when you have these long-term impacts, you can have a core identity shift. And when a core identity shift happens, it's possible to have long-term transformation without actually implementing any behavioral changes. And the way they described this was really interesting. They talked about an individual that has this experience. Let's say they were a heavy drinker and they were at the bar every night. They had this experience, they have a core identity shift. And then according to Miller, they don't need to change their behaviors to stop drinking. Like that's okay, I have this habit I need to change. It's like the person becomes a non-drinker. No changes need to be made. No behavioral changes or anything need to be made. The person is just now a new person, and that actually creates the implementation and the behavioral change without actually having to move anything in terms of their process. They're not having to go out and say, oh, I need to really focus on not drinking tonight. It's just not even interest. So that's a really interesting part of this core identity shift. That doesn't happen so often. More than likely, what's going to happen is this, where it's going to require additional reflection and discernment, and then takes you on the road to implementation and everything else. But I'll talk about this area here in a little bit. So here we have sort of some indicators of a sudden change to really unpack what does this mean, sudden transformation, right? What are the qualities? And the numbers here, it was out of 100 in terms of my database. So the numbers here show a pretty high rate for these three. And then about half of them had enduring qualities, which means that about half of them would be good to research again, to look back and say, was this transformative for you? Did you feel that there's an enduring change that happened? So to kind of explain these a little bit more, on Vivid, we have sort of qualities that would be like amazing, outstanding. I'll remember this, for the rest of my life. This was the worst experience of my life. This is the best experience of my life. It's like the first time this has ever happened. Those kind of indicate some vivid qualities, right? So about 97 had a few different, oftentimes more than one of these occurring in an experience. Benevolent was the next one. Now, quantum change originally emerges from this idea of religious conversion. I think that's like the core. So they're talking about somebody has a mystical experience, a moment, and they change into do a religion. Miller and Sedabaka, who did this study, changed that so that it could be more psychologically oriented. So they changed it from what was originally like this idea of an external other to benevolent, right? Here it was a little bit more external other meaning that there's an agency outside of oneself. What I found with the ayahuasca, though, I had to expand it because it wasn't just benevolent, meaning positive, but sometimes malevolent and sometimes ambivalent. The malevolent was interesting because even though people realized it was really scary or frightening, they were like, oh, okay, wow, actually, I trust that this experience was for the best. That was said in multiple of the experiences, right? So it had a different kind of relationship to it. The ambivalent is really interesting because, on the base level, you think, oh, this is my experience. Everything that's in that world should be paying attention to me because I'm having the experience. If we believe in the idea of projection, if we believe in the idea that this is just a part of our own brain or our own mind doing this thing. But it's really weird when all of a sudden the characters in the experience consider you a tourist or don't pay attention to you or ignore you like you don't exist. Because then you're like, wait a second, isn't this part of my... So there's a way that some people were thinking, is there like some independent agency to these, is there an intelligence outside of me actually interacting, not just with a vision, but with an actual being that's in this world? So that was really interesting for folks as they try to sort of suss out what this ambivalent benevolent quality was. Enduring was, like I said, long-term change. So psychological change would be something like, I felt like I healed, or I mended a relationship with my parents who have been dead for 20 years, or anything like that. You can hear those types of things. This core identity shift, I'll actually play a clip in a minute, talks about sort of this core shattering, sort of like when everything is just gone away. And I mentioned that in the previous slide too. That's where you can have those behavioral changes without actually changing anything. But that needs a lot more support in terms of rebuilding back up because everything's just kind of demolished and at ground zero. Another one that's really interesting is this idea of symbolic latency. So it's this idea that the experience comes and sometimes it's, people say, oh, I downloaded my information. I would say that my experience I spoke of in Arbor before was also symbolic. Like I knew this thing happened, but I didn't know what it was yet. And it's like, these are the experiences that maybe 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road, you have this aha moment, right? This epiphany, like, oh, that's what that was. And it's basically that's basically a recording of all the stuff that you've done in between to learn to get to that point where that symbol can now emerge and flower and actually be relevant. So it's actually kind of like this hidden information in you that's waiting for you to learn the correct lessons so that you can actually get it. So integration in that process is going to take a lot longer, and that's more of a personal thing because it's about the daily routine, it's about the daily lessons, it's about the insights that you gain over time. And then the very, very sort of core I think, of the transformative process is this surprise element, right? The surprise is the it's the separation, it's the opportunity to breathe, it's sort of the gasp of the moment, right? And in here, you're going to have your insights, you're going to have your mystical epiphanies, you're going to have profound moments, you're going to have things that are ineffable that you can't quite put a word onto. And all of these here, in terms of categories, are really just sort of like, as I was saying earlier, we don't want to be inputting meaning into the individual, but if you can hear these things, if people start talking about these things, you know there's some really juicy stuff here. And this is where you want to help people, at least the research that I was doing and what I'm theorizing, is this is going to be the spot where you may want to help people unpack. If you hear these words, if you hear these ideas, because they're the things that are really kind of working through the individual, and they're not really sure how to touch on it. And rather than talk about the narratives, you can kind of point out these things and then unpack what's in there. And like I said, everyone's narratives can be slightly different, but this will give you a starting point. Oops. So here we have some examples of enduring. As I mentioned earlier, enduring was sort of like people knew instantly something had changed and they passed through a one-way door, which there's no return. They were changed right then. They knew instantly, you know, they were freed right then, I should say. So that's pretty powerful for a simple, you know, maybe hour, 2 hour, 5 hour experience. And then that's going to last with them through the whole time, through the whole rest of their life, right? And according to this theory, it would. And I'm going to play a couple of these just to give you some examples of some enduring transcripts that were mentioned in here, just so you can get a sense of like the fullness of the change that people are already seeing even 12 hours after the experience.
Beyond anything I've ever felt. It was beyond death. It was beyond insanity. You know, I felt for sure insanity is gone. Death is gone. It's not even a rebirth. I can't explain it. It's just like a core shattering.
So here we, like I say, is beyond death, beyond insanity, beyond anything that he's ever thought about, core shattering. Like the whole structure is just out. And so now there's this long process of rebuilding, right? The next one is more about, and I'm sure you've probably all heard this a million times, is sort of, and there's just an actual example of it being said in a transcript. And maybe they heard this before, but who knows, you know, it's better than 100 years of therapy. And also this idea of latency. It's in there and I don't really know what it was. Here, I'll just play it for you.
With each level I had to process. It felt like 100 years of therapy just rapidly accelerating in a short amount of time. So I don't know exactly what was being uncovered. I don't know if the dots I was connecting was symbolic of something I needed to process, but I don't think it matters. Good work happened. It was difficult, but I felt like I could face it, and within the difficulties, it was just ineffably beautiful.
So again, we have this sort of idea that he knows that something really important happened. You know, it doesn't really matter to him at that moment to make meaning of it, but over time, that'll probably advance. I think what's really important about this is that, you know, it suggests that these experiences have a long-term impact, whether or not they're integrated or implemented. So that's where you really want to sort of get the most out of it for the individual, really helping them sort of unpack it a little bit better. And this last one here is about sort of forgiving the past and starting anew.
Anything that's happened in the past is all forgiven, is all what it is. And I accept it, and it's there, and at the same time, it's the past. So I really feel like now my life starts again, over, of who I am consciously. It's the greatest gift I can possibly imagine.
So imagine that this is the greatest gift he can imagine, to be able to start from scratch. And so how important is it to make sure that that person with their greatest gift is the one directing this new opportunity, this new narrative, this new opportunity for growth, and not necessarily being sort of influenced by outside sort of means, right? So really honoring that person's process and allowing them to unpack everything as their own. And so all of these here kind of lead us to this chart here, which is sort of the integration, the archetypes of transformation that I found in this particular database. There's probably, like I say, tons more. I only found about 6 of them. But what I noticed was there were sort of 2 meta themes. There's meta themes that involved a death-like ordeal, and there's meta themes that involved no death-like ordeal. And so that would be like a Kundalini activation, which is actually pretty rare for ours, the life lineage history, which showed up around 20 times or so. So it was pretty common, or not common, but at least it was present. The unit of mystical experience was pretty present, and then the transpersonal journey. Here we have sort of two representations of death. The first one is a passive sense of dying. And people often had a positive experience here, like, oh, I was dying. I felt like I was dying. My experience was, I faced my fear around death, and it was really blissful. It was really beautiful, really positive, right? So if somebody's like, oh yeah, I had a death experience, okay, if it's a death and rebirth experience, it's going to be significantly different than a transpersonal ordeal. And these are where there's death, dismemberment, torture, active interaction with entities that are in the space, potentially a surgery. And typically these aren't really to torture the individual. It's really an upgrade, which allows them to make it into these places, which are transpersonal realms, multidimensional realms, soul homes, spiritual realms, alien spaces, those types of things. So this is part of the process to get here, but a much more difficult process for folks than just the death and rebirth process. And then if you look down here, the transpersonal journey, this would be kind of the same thing as a transpersonal ordeal in terms of where people are going, but it doesn't involve that death-like ordeal. So instead, what's happening is they're sort of winning the battle. And one person made a really interesting statement in there. He says, most of my experiences, I die. And this time I sort of fought whatever it was that was coming after me, and I won. And I noticed that the sense of humbleness was different. I wasn't as humble as my previous experiences, much more sort of inflated, because I won this battle, I won this sort of victory. And so just really interesting to know that even between these two, that whole process of dying can have a different effect on how they make meaning of where they go afterwards, what was happening during the experience. So again, just to sort of reiterate, it's really, really crucial to kind of know the differences. Now, these narratives will change between all these kind of things, but there's these primary indicators and these secondary indicators, and just kind of the ways to look at the difference, because here's the unit of mystical experience, which is the one that's talked about at Johns Hopkins or NYU. But there's quite a few other experiences that can have some value, can have some meaning making that's needed, that don't really fall into this category. So again, important to know the bigger context. Oh yeah, also one other thing I noticed, I did originally have in the data a near-death experience in here. What I noticed was that the near-death experience was so similar to the death and rebirth experience, but it's called a near-death experience because it's relating to a physical near-death, which is Moody's in the 1960s or 70s was looking at people that die and medically die and then come back from life. So he calls it a near-death experience. But it doesn't really work so much for these experiences, because in these experiences, people feel that they do die, but there's no actual process around dying. So I'm actually arguing for, rather than using near-death experience for these types of experiences, use something a little bit more clear, which would be like a death and rebirth experience, which have a lot of the same qualities. All right, back to the dissertation page. So we talked about the transformation over here. We talked about the quantum change indicators and the kind of criteria there. And what is the content that might be useful to make meaning of this? So these qualities here, was it fully immersive? Did it make the person question the nature of reality? Was there some sort of benevolent quality? How was it enduring? These types of things, surprise. Did it come through? Did it have some insights in it? Sometimes those insights are really clear. Like I said here, it's like, okay, you have this insight. You realize like, oh yeah, I was totally being an ass to that person, and I need to straighten that out. So you just implement that and you go on your way. Perfect, done. But a lot of times that's not the case, that it's that clear cut. So integration cues is one of the things I was looking at, which includes insights and activities. The archetypes of transformation I was just speaking about with the no death-like ordeal and death-like ordeal. And then we look at sort of the benevolence in relationship to the archetypes. So this would be the essential impact. What's the essential impact? Now, if the person, again, it was a malevolent experience of a transpersonal ordeal, but they trusted that it was for the best, they're going to have a different process around how they experience that than someone on the other side. And both of these actually occurred in the database, where somebody had a really, was really scared and a unit of mystical experience. And when they finally stopped being scared, they realized it was positive and blissful. Well, again, that's going to be a totally different sort of relationship to that essential impact. So I basically took all these here to create this little questionnaire kind of thing, not really so ask these questions, but listen to the person speaking, see what things come out, maybe sort of ask some clarifying questions. And then once all that information is sussed out, as I said, that's when you can start going into the integration process, at least in my opinion. because now you have the information that'll help you make meaning of it. You're not just sort of taking one track down and you're forgetting about this whole thing, which actually contradicts what's going on. You've had the opportunity to really sort of suss out what's there, and then you can go from there. So then once you're here, I can't see that on my screen, but so then you look at, okay, do we need assimilation, accommodation, transformation, or beyond? And then once you look at your paradigm, how you want to shift it, then you start the meaning making process. Now you've looked at it, you've had constructive feedback, maybe dynamic constructive feedback with the community, then you can implement, and then you can go into this. So really this whole process is to like separate out integration, to really make more sense of it, to see like, what are the elements? What are we really talking about? When someone says integration, we're not just talking about, oh yeah, go meditate or write in your journal or get out in nature, which is what you typically hear. But what are the things that we're really trying to unpack here? What are the moments? Where's the clarity? Where's the information that's juiciest? And how can we help that emerge? And that's kind of what I'm trying to sort of focus on here. And really, hopefully, will be something that'll be a little bit more common in integration, is a more complicated or sophisticated conversation around these elements here. So here, kind of go into some integration Q activities. So these are the things I was saying earlier. This is usually what you hear about when someone's like, oh, what do you need to do for integration? So, you know, a lot of these things will come up. I think Francois Bourzet's recent book, she has a lot of these practices in there, 5 theory model or something like that. What I found were the main ones. We have sort of these practices, you have this attitude, and then service. So practices are things that you can do, right? Attitude is like how you perceive the world, how you view things. So like having a healthy attitude, being a lover of life, et cetera, et cetera. And then service is sort of reciprocity. How do you sort of give back? How do you sort of offer yourself to the bigger community as part of an integration process? So those were the 3 main topics. And then under practices, we have emotional, creative, environment, community, physical, mental, and transpersonal, spiritual. So that's all things that can be done to help with the process, but sometimes that's meaning making and sometimes that's settling or grounding or some of these other kind of things. So again, kind of playing with what these words mean really. And then I want to show you this next one, which is the interesting one, as said earlier. It really kind of got me thinking about like, what is integration? I was after I read this, I was like, okay, now I have a better sense of what integration is. And then I realized that I also had biases, which is that I believe at the time, and still do for the most part, that this world is real, right? And when you kind of throw that out the window, now you're like, wait a second, where are we bringing information back to? So I'm going to play this little clip here so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about.
How do I bring back the things I experienced back into my life? And it was like, you've got it backwards. You're not trying to bring that here. You're trying to remember how to get back there. It's a manifestation of that confusion that we feel like we want to, that is a place you visit and you come back home here. But instead, there is home. Here is where we learn things and we'll eventually return there.
So again, from the perspective of meaning making, you know, I might be out of my element on this one because it forces a reversal of how we think about what is our place here. Maybe the best person there would be someone that knows about Buddhism or some other of these sort of spiritual traditions that really speak to this sort of dynamic that he's speaking to, this is the illusory state and there's actually a soul home somewhere else that is considered real. And we're just here learning to get back there at some point in time. So how do you help make meaning of that? I don't know. That's something that I think we all kind of need to discover. But what's important about that is it really got me thinking about the different layers and levels of the different processes. So I put together this little handy dandy chart here. And basically this looks at the different ways of discussing where things may go or how things may go and who might be qualified to do the things that may go in this process. So here we have the fully immersive experience would be the questioning nature of reality. That's a very good possibility. Here we have some insights. So we have in this research, everyday insights, imminent divine insights, consciousness and transpersonal insights, and ayahuasca specific knowledge. We have these quantum change indicators here, you see across the bottom here. We have the archetypes of transformation and their essential impact here across the top. So here, if you look here on this bottom box, we have assimilation. And I sort of posit that this is the best spot for clinicians, psychotherapists that are within the same worldview, embodied practices, implementation coaches, or peer support. So these are the different people that could possibly have some value in helping with this integration, because assimilation basically means this is the worldview, the information happens, and it gets digested back into this worldview. There's no change in the original paradigm, something that, you know, can be done with someone that knows just the basics of pretty much whatever, right? You know, obviously therapists and things like that would be great for them. But then there's areas that kind of step out of that boundary. It's not really the therapist's role to learn this in their system oftentimes. So here I would say accommodation, which is sort of an expansion of paradigms. Oh, never mind. So this would be an expansion of paradigms. So rather than digesting it into the original paradigm like this, it now expands out and requires new understanding of that paradigm in order to grok the information that was in there. And here are some suggestions I had for people that could be valuable: depth and transpersonal psychologists, integration facilitators, philosophical and existential support systems. So it's not in therapy, but it's more about questions of the nature of reality, that type of thing, and embodied practices. And like I say, each of these are sort of the qualities that were in these experiences. Next one, we have the yellow, which is the transformation of paradigms. So this would be like, Ralph Metzer says the immortality of the soul is probably one of the most profound experiences for individuals, because they realize that the soul goes beyond the body and it moves on through there. So this is, for somebody that's a neuroscientist, it might be pretty tricky to believe that, so that's going to take a transformation. It's going to take an entire redevelopment of their worldview. And same with all of these. So these are all like multidimensional realms, mystical unity, core shift in identity, some of these ineffable experiences. All those could be transformation paradigms. And that might be a spiritual transpersonal mentor, integration facilitator, peer support, and transformative education. Now, the one that's really interesting is sort of this outward ring. And that would be where the soul home is. That would be where an ayahuasca experience where you're like, okay, I learned how to navigate in this realm without a body, or I learned how to, to defeat this being that I need to defeat in order to get to this next level, or I learned how to relax when, they're doing surgery on me. Also, I learned the importance of purging for navigation, like all these kind of weird things that they're not really going to be assimilated into your worldview. They're not going to be really transformed or accommodated. It's really kind of its own unique thing. But there's not really a place for that unless you're talking to some elders that are pretty familiar with the work, or looking at people that are actually doing this work themselves and have had similar experiences, because you're not really going to be able to make meaning of it, but it's a good opportunity to explore, to discuss, to engage in conversation, to learn new things, to create new models, this type of thing. And really the only way you can do that is to have somebody else that's had a similar experience that you can chat with about it. So if you look at this here, we have sort of these couple different layers. Again, the assimilation. This is good for therapists and this type of thing. These are basic ideas. These are, psychological issues, stuff in life, that type of thing. Accommodation, which maybe expands a little bit farther out, could speak about heaven, could speak about chakras, profound experiences, that type of thing. Transformation, which might take a little bit more work because you're rebuilding an entire new paradigm, or the individual is, I should say. This would be immortality of the soul, mystical unity, those types of things. And then the peer support, or the beyond, is what I called it. I didn't have a good name for it, so if anyone has a good name, write it in the chat box. But this area right here would be sort of this other area where people are sort of better, I think, making meaning of it by talking to a community of peers, or a community of support, or a community that already knows what this experience is about. So I'm going to go over my 45 minutes by a little bit, but not too much. So. Okay, so that's why we do peer integration circles with ERIE, because most importantly for us, it was how do we help people with these experiences? A lot of times, even if they're in this sort of accommodation realm, it's going to be hard for most people to go. I know for myself and all the people that have been coming to the circles, oftentimes it's hard to go to a therapist to talk about this stuff, So how can we create a safe space for people that people can sit down, they can share, they can feel heard, they can make meaning of it. No one's sort of forcing a meaning on it. There's opportunity for reflection. And it's an opportunity for healing that doesn't necessarily require sort of the current modalities, right? So in these peer circles, we emphasize that we're peer sharing. We're neither therapists or counselors. And we also emphasize this as an educational opportunity. We're all learning together, and we're not going to always be right. And most importantly, people will learn skills so they can bring skills to their community to do integration work. Because we're not going to be able to touch everybody, but every one of the people in the circle are also talking to other people. And so they can get some skill sets that they can share with others, and then they can bring that and help their community gain insight. And as this sort of Decriminalize Nature thing's happening, everything else is happening, this is really important. The more people that know about integration, or at least know how to sit with somebody and help them unpack something, I think it would be really valuable to help reduce challenging experiences. So our basic setup, we kind of do like a circle. It's very much, talking circle style. Some people have compared it to like a kind of a 12-step in terms of sharing, or an old school sort of talking, sharing sort of a council model where people are coming together in a circle and sharing. So we kind of set up the prep space. We like to have an altar in the center with some sacred objects, candle, cloth. We want to make sure that we have seats for everybody. If there's 10, 15 people, we want to make sure we have enough seats to take care of that. We really emphasize the talking stick. So whoever has a talking stick has the floor. We suggest, and I've done this a few times by myself, and it's a lot to hold for a single person to do an 11-person circle because there's a lot of energy there. There's a lot of things going on. So really suggest having a male-female dynamic. There's a balance of energy there. There's an opportunity to hold and support each other through the process. We can both sort of co-facilitate the circle. And then a stopwatch or a bell to help keep the time going. Typically, the time is about, like I said, about limit of 15. We don't do any more than 15 because you don't have enough time and it takes a really long time for folks. Preferably we do 10 or 11 attendees. For beginners that are just starting facilitation circles, maybe start around 8 or something like that. Typically we allow 4 to 5 minutes of sharing and 4 to 5 minutes of reflection. That's actually just about the perfect time. We've had a couple circles where there's a smaller group and we kind of jumped it up to 7 minutes. We found in 7 minutes that people kind of get circular and lost in what they're saying sometimes, and that also it's harder for the people to reflect because there was so much information that was given that they might have forgotten some key elements. So really about 4 to 5 minutes is pretty solid in terms of a sharing opportunity for this type of circle. The 4 to 5 minutes of reflection is amazing. I know there's a few people on here that are doing ERIE integration circles with us, and it's always just amazing to hear their reflections that aren't coming from myself or Julie, who co-facilitates with me, but from the people in the circle that have already had their experiences, really honoring the wisdom that people are coming from because they're learning as well from these experiences. And I've been blown away by some of the reflections I hear that I'm like, taking notes and everything. So really sort of trust that process, right? Sort of the structure of the sharing, we start off with some opening and guidelines. We do a little icebreaker, maybe a little meditation to kind of settle everything down with some guidelines. That's about the first 15 minutes. It's about 2 hours, I believe we usually do. We do a popcorn style, so no one is really sort of required to share. Anyone can share at their leisure. We leave space for everyone to share if they'd like to, but some people just like to listen or ask questions, or maybe they're totally new. They just want to kind of participate. So that's something we do. If somebody goes past the 5 minutes, we have the bell on the ringer that goes off, but they can kind of continue talking to the reflection time. But we really want to keep it tight so that, people don't go over their second bell because otherwise it'll sort of eat into other people's time. So we try and be really strict with the timing. It's always better if you have an alarm on your phone because when that happens, the alarm goes off. It's not your fault. You're not the one ringing the bell. It's like, oh, I got to turn the alarm off. And so then people kind of get it that it's time to sort of move to their next experience. We also tell people if there's anything more that they need to share afterwards, please contact us. We're open and available for that. Between every share, we try and leave a moment of silence because sometimes there's some really heavy things that are shared. So just kind of give a break between all that so everything's settled. And then at the end, we sort of close up about 20 minutes. We give people some announcements. We close up about 5 minutes to the end. And then we sort of ask some, how did everyone do? We have like a closing quote, some final words, and then we sort of close the circle. So it's really sort of a sacred space that we're creating here. It's a ceremonial space that's allowing for sharing, it's allowing for opening. It really honors, it's not judgmental, not hierarchical, really just honors the person's experience and the reflections of people. Really, and I'll kind of go on this in the next slide, but really want to, right here, talk about wanting to give advice, not wanting to give advice, but suggestions. So not like, you need to do this thing. But hey, I read this book and it's pretty interesting because they talk about this little area in chapter 4. You might want to check that out, right? It's not always easy to do. We kind of chuckle about it in our circles because sometimes we find ourselves giving advice more than suggestions, but that's just a really kind of good mode to go with. You really want to be comfortable with awkward silences because sometimes there's just going to be a need to wait and you don't want to jump in. You want to allow for other people to reflect. You want to kind of figure out how to address someone that's giving a challenging reflection or maybe is off kilter or maybe is doing something that they aren't really hearing the person. So as a facilitator of a circle like this, that is one thing, mostly your peers, but for sometimes you want to sort of have opportunity to really sort of stop people and interrupt people if you need to. Interrupt gracefully though, if you can, and acknowledge your mistakes because it is, a process that we're all learning. And I think really coming at it from the forefront is like, this is an educational process that we're all learning about. And this is something that we can learn together as we sort of grow this. I think it's a good way to sort of start off the process so everyone feels that they're invested and they're part of it as well, And then at the very end, I really recommend working with your co-facilitator, whoever that might be, debrief after, hey, this worked well, this didn't work well, I noticed you caught this thing or not this thing. These are really a good opportunity to sort of connect and sort of, figure out what happened in the circle and kind of feel together in that. So if you want to do any circles like this, I can send some information as well, but it's really easy to do. It's really, it's just an informal process. Some people are like, oh, how do you do this thing? What's going on? But it's really, really simple. And I think just the opportunity to create community around this and create an opportunity for people to learn and make meaning without something being sort of, put into their heads, just allowing the natural unfolding to happen is really, really valuable for folks. So I definitely recommend this. And if you guys have any questions around this, I'd be happy to answer them. And that is the end for me. So thank you very much. That's my email if you want to contact me. On Instagram, these are our Instagram's accounts, and we have websites there if you want to check out our websites, ERIE and Decriminalize Nature. So thank you very much, everybody, and I will answer any questions or dialogues that happen now if you like. Yes, so I can I can send that to you for you to post somewhere. We do have that as far as this basic guidelines. We have that we've been sending out for ERIE. We don't have it on our website yet. I give sort of a little portion of a workshop that we do that's a little bit more involved in terms of how do you do a circle. But yeah, if you just contact me later, I can send you at least the one-pager plus on that, and then you can post that wherever you need. Or I can put it on our website too. I don't know if it's easier for them to go through you or what. Yeah. Should I answer a couple questions that are in the chats while we're doing that? We are trying to. We have tried that. It's such a different feel, and I'm trying to get used to it. Just because you don't have that same kind of engaged process, and there's like a computer, and then somebody will drop off in the middle of something important, or like it'll be all fritzy or whatever. So it can get kind of tricky doing it online. But we are trying and learning how to do that, and I'm sure that'll happen over time. So, but hopefully we'll be done with Corona before then. And I want to say hi to Laura, who's here from one of our circles. Hey, Laura. I also see that somebody says, please define soul home. I don't know if I defined it well for you in the PowerPoint, but basically this would be a place that your soul lives and is sort of dreaming or being this person, and this person is learning in this reality of illusion experiences to take back to the soul home, wherever that might be. So that would be kind of the idea that this is the illusion, and where the soul lives, according to this experience, and this happened in a couple of different experiences too, a place where they're like, oh, I knew this place, I knew all the characters, I knew the buildings, it was super crazy. I'd never been there before, but it was so familiar. All these kind of qualities were coming up. And that was really unique because it was like, how does a person, this real strong sense that they remember the place so vividly, but they had never been there before. And that it was them that was creating it, and that it was their home, and it was their library, and it was their friends, and all these different types of things. So it was really interesting. And it came up, like I said, in multiple different experiences. So it wasn't necessarily just one person that had that experience. It was like not super common, but I think 4 or 5 experiences showed up. So next one I have, how long after the journey before you do a peer integration circle? It's a good question. I would say, yeah, it's kind of across the board. Some people are, they want to sort of unpack right away. Some people want to let it settle first and kind of see, if you are waiting a little bit of time, and sometimes you just don't have access to a peer integration circle right away. It might not be till the next month or whatever that another one comes up. But, at those moments of time, you can almost kind of go through some of the charts that I was saying earlier and ask yourself, like, what was surprising to me? When I compare this to other experiences, what is about that, so you can kind of start to suss out some of that pre-integration strategy framework for yourself to really get a sense of like what's there. And then you'll be able to really sort of focus on specific things that you're kind of looking at in the integration circle. So whether or not you do it right away, sometimes, people do it right after an experience, which is great, but you can feel that in the circle. Like they're still trying to like suss out what the words are for some of these ineffable places, and it's kind of strange, and they're like, it's like this, but beautiful because we're creating new language. It's not this, it's like a combination of these two things, and it means this thing, and people are like, oh yeah, totally. So it's great to see. I mean, imagine in 10 years the type of language and the type of sophistication we'll have around discussing these experiences because we've had an opportunity to practice. Let's see, next I have great. Thank you, Casey. Change the integration group. I'll be happy to help you out if you want to talk a little bit more about that. Great. Thank you, Suri. Great structure to get the most out of integration sharing. I like the clear objectives. Thank you. Love this therapeutic milieu. So well thought out. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Laura G, good friend. These are very fulfilling experiences. She knows just how great these experiences are. Hey, Laura, nice to see you. And
it's nice to see you, Larry. Larry, if you don't mind, I would also like for you to remind folks that people come to the integration circle with experiences of many of us have been seniors and have never had an opportunity to ever discuss honestly, privately, truthfully, things that we experienced as young folks that were part of our lives now, but we have never been able to express in a safe, integrated way. And the opportunity in these circles allows us to go back. And I've come to the group immediately after coming back from Costa Rica. So there is no time more appropriate than when you're feeling need for support. And that's exactly what the circles do. So thank you for that, Larry and Julie. You guys are great.
Thank you very much, Laura. I appreciate it. It's always a pleasure. Laura's one of those people that has reflections and insights that just blow your mind. You're just like, wow, how did you know that? What's going on? So, and I think you're right too, that you're seeing that too, is like people that finally have a space to share, because even for myself, like I may have 5 friends and they're like, oh, I don't want to hear about your experience anymore. And that's understandable, things are happening, people are whatever, or maybe people are like too much in the party mode. Oh, that sacred experience, that's kind of weird, but here's this opportunity, as Laura was saying, to really kind of come back and maybe even have an opportunity to go even farther back to experiences that are still kind of hanging out, still have that symbolic latency, still have some ideas and insights that are there, but you just haven't quite unpacked yet. So yeah, I think this is a really great opportunity. And so across the board, it's really just get in circles and share, Let's see. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, I actually have a few questions about sort of, I guess, like some of the theory and underlying, scientific psychological understanding of this. As you said, it's for many people, it's difficult to sort of understand these ineffable experiences in the context of, the mechanistic understanding of, cognitive science. And, I was wondering how we sort of reconcile the current research, what we're seeing about the changes in terms of neuroplasticity, neuroconnectivity, and how these correlate with these sort of transcendental experiences. Like, how do we reconcile these? And, I'm wondering if we can, if these mechanistic changes or these observations, these neurochemical changes, if these might be considered to be like epiphenomena resulting from the action or activities of the soul within some sort of transcendental space, which cannot be quite empirically dealt with. Or I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, just on the second part, I think that's funny because usually we say that a lot of times neuroscientists will say that these visions are an epiphenomena of the brain activity, right? You kind of went backwards or the other way and said that the brain activity is an epiphenomena of the soul experience. So I like that kind of view of that. It kind of went in a different direction. So I appreciate that. And yeah, I don't think you really, I think the reconciliation is like we're talking on 2 different things, like, okay, you can look at the brain, you can see what's happening. It's important to know where it's activated and all that kind of thing, but that's not really telling you about the inner experience. And, we see a lot of these studies today, it's helping with depression or anxiety or what have you. And maybe that's the case, but, it doesn't really talk about this. They're kind of looking at it more on from this is how it looks in the brain. And that's how we know it's helping in these areas. I personally believe that it's really important to look at the inner experience in terms of why it is that it's helping with depression or anxiety or PTSD or addiction therapy, all that kind of thing. But I don't think it's necessarily wrong to say this is what happens in the brain. And now there is some concern around, I think there was some study a couple of years ago that showed that some software that a lot of the fMRIs was using, there was a glitch in it. So 40,000 studies plus all the studies that those quoted are probably faulty, So that's the downside of studies relying too much on the those quoted are probably faulty. So that type of thing, because you don't know where along the line that programming is coming in. You don't know how it's being interpreted. You just see that an area of the brain is lighting up. There's a lot of speculation as to what that even means, that type of thing. But I think it's really important because it does give us, when I studied neuroscience as my undergrad, the question that got me sort of in the other direction with the mystical experience is this, the hard problem of consciousness, that Chalmers idea, right? No matter how far down you go, you never can find the hop from neuron to consciousness, right? And, Stuart Hameroff talks about microtubule collapse in third and fourth dimension. There's some people that had some interesting theories about that, but you really can't get in that crossover, right? But that doesn't mean that that's not valuable. It just means that I'm kind of going the other way and going really just into the meaning making process, because that experience to the individual is visceral. They can feel it, their whole body shifts. Sometimes people get chills just talking about their experiences, or tears, or all this kind of thing. So it's affecting them. And no one knows what's going on in the brain when that's happening, but you can see it. So really to value sort of that inner experience, the phenomenology. And you're starting to see some of the studies look into it in terms of the science, Johns Hopkins, NYU are looking a little bit more into phenomenology, but there's always this battle right now between quantitative and qualitative research, right? Quantitative people say, oh, qualitative research isn't really important. It's not really says anything, and then qualitative people say, well, quantitative just puts everything in boxes and doesn't really give you the full sort of richness of what's going on there. So again, this is the idea of paradigms. We're really sort of at this rub of paradigms right now, and sort of these medicines really allow us to expand a little bit, say, wait a second, this paradigm is kind of a little bit restricting. How can we add to it? So hopefully in the end we'll have sort of a nice, beautiful sort of mesh of these different things, learning from each other. But good questions. I think that's something that we're going to have to really kind of figure out, is how to reconcile these two ideas, and to allow for the person's, personal experience and the feelings of that experience to be relevant to this conversation.
No, certainly. I have one further question, and this sort of does relate to, understanding these experiences through different, therapeutic and psychological, modalities. And I think especially with regard to, what you were saying about quantum change, about these almost like spontaneous, existential experiences and changes in personal identity. It seems in many ways to put into question like a lot of the bases of behaviorism. That is that at least this would suggest that behavioral change is possible without conditioning. I don't know. What do you think? Like, did you think that this is a sort of a sweeping implication, or can this exist? Or can this coexist, so to say, with an understanding of human behavior through behaviorist?
It's such an interesting thing, because I think we have kind of pigeonholed ourselves in sort of Western therapy or therapeutic modalities to kind of have these very structured ideas, and that's why I think this is so important for psychology, for mental health, for everything, because it forces us to ask these new questions, like, is it possible to change without sort of all these other things, as you were saying with behaviorism, or is it possible to change with a mystical or spiritual experience, or what does it look like when you're talking about sort of the different structures and different sort of philosophies behind the psychology that you're talking about, and what is the value of just kind of like breaking everything down into like, this thing happens, you ring the bell. It was that with Pavlov's dog, right? That's behaviorism. Is that in that same realm, right? Ring the bell, he drools, and that's it, So, but maybe he's drooling because he was dreaming of this beautiful big T-bone steak that had nothing to do with the bell at exactly that time, who knows? But I think that's what's really fascinating about sort of this research, and I'm really excited about, is because it's going to cause a more complex understanding of mental health, a more complex understanding of psychology. Even Jung, which a lot of people talk about as being sort of the in-between, like, well, help with integration by using these sort of Jungian symbols and talking about depth psychology, like that's even still falls short, even the Red Book. I don't know if you've read the Red Book before, but Jung has this Red Book that came out in 1913, which is basically his sort of exploration of his own consciousness. And really weird, I talked to Stan Groff and a couple other people that said it wasn't the case, but in the beginning of it, he says, the book reminded me of this was like doing a mescaline experience. I was like, it's such a weird thing for someone to say if they never had a mescaline experience, right? Because how would you know it's like a mescaline experience, right? So, but unfortunately, I haven't really heard anything in terms of him actually having experiences, but the way the book reads is like that. But even still, there's this idea of sort of being in sort of the subconscious, or the unconscious, or these types of things. There's a guy, Sri Aurobindo, who does integral consciousness, who actually critique Jung a little bit, because he's saying that if we're pulling from that, it's different than if we're pulling from the spirit. Right. There's a different kind of layer and level. So yeah, all these different areas are coming together: integral psychology, depth psychology, transpersonal psychology, behavioral psychology, CBT, all that kind of stuff. They're all going to have to learn together. Neuroscience, learn together what works here, because here's this area of study that kind of blows everything out of the water. It's totally new. all the different assumptions of every different one could be challenged by some of these experiences. So lots of work for us to do as psychologists and integration specialists for sure.
I certainly think it'd be interesting to see where all this research takes us over the next few decades.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for the detailed answers.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for the questions. Appreciate it.
I'm wondering, this is kind of a complex question. I'm wondering, well, whenever I journey, I always write down, plenty of questions to address and explore and journey with, and always I'll have a question of what's the best next way. What's the best way to utilize my next journey? Like, so within the journey space, I ask about the next journey space, and I find that is helpful in refining my journey, but also integration in some way, even though you're in the journey, let's say. But so I'm wondering, in the integration circle, do you ever talk about how to refine your journees? Because, and if so, I wonder what percentage, and then what you're talking about. Because what I'm really thinking about is what really struck me in your presentation was like the soul home. I mean, if there was a way to shoot for the stars for that, so to speak, and go for that specifically, or whatever experience within whatever type of medium one uses, and then have a group of people, a group effort in their own individual journeys to go for that goal, and then compare notes on an integration type circle, and then in other words, brainstorming on refining a journey during like one of these types of circles. I guess it may or may not have to do with integration, but in a way it is. That's why I'm thinking this is a complex question.
No, I mean, I like the question. I see where you're going with this, and we definitely talk a lot about intention. So intention would be something, oftentimes people say what their intention was, or whether or not they got anything out of it that related to their intention. So that's there. And then sometimes people speak to their intentions of their next journey and that type of thing. But I really like this idea of sort of working together as like a cohort. And that's something we haven't really done. We've been lucky to have a nice, consistent group of people that have kind of gone into the integration circle over time. So there is kind of a cohort sense that's been built up, but there hasn't really been a sense of yet of a group integrating together over maybe a 6-month, 1-year period of time, that in between time, they're actually also being like, hey, okay, let's, because I think the Sione tradition in the Amazon will do this, the shaman will sing them, or the ayahuasquero will sing them to the third river by the second tree in the third heaven or something like that. And they'll all go to a place, so this is really interesting, because that also suggests that there are places to go to. It's such a difference between there's an archetype and no, that's the street corner that everyone sees. It's not an archetype, it actually exists. So an archetype suggests more of a symbolic kind of representation, right? So I hope that at some point in time in the future, we'll be able to be a little bit more sort of evolved in this process and really sort of do, and I'm sure there are probably people that are doing this right now, exploring together to say, hey, can we achieve something together as a group? Can we do it when we're apart in our own singular experiences? Because that bonding of that integration circle, you're kind of connecting people with their sort of transpersonal selves together. Is it possible to explore what that looks like? And now you're getting kind of this different realm, and this is maybe more like Kalindi's doing in Detroit, or Kalindi's community is doing in Detroit. We're actually sort of exploring these transpersonal spaces. They're recording the information. They're sort of reading the information that they're getting from that. So I know there are communities that are doing that for sure. We haven't actually really tried it too much with our integration circles, because I think we're a 501c3 and we're trying to be a little cautious. We do a lot of our work in Berkeley and some in Oakland. So when we're in Berkeley, technically it's not decriminalized yet. And also 501c3 is sort of a federal thing. So we want to be a little cautious, but I think absolutely that's what's exciting for me, because the experience I had when I talked about Ann Arbor where that flame went out, there's all these side things. There's all these kind of other weird mind things that can happen that we really don't even have a starting point on as far as understanding. So would it be great to kind of go together and say, okay, let's try this thing and then come back in the next session and see what that looks like? I'm not sure if that really addressed your question, but I think it's a good idea in terms of exploration in the future.
Yeah, it does. Yes, that's exactly what I'm thinking about. And I think also it would add, it would potentiate the adding of future language that you mentioned.
Right, exactly, yeah. Because now you're sort of, as a group, kind of coming to a conclusion as to what that experience or that sense might be in a verbal language.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
I thought I would jump in. I took some notes as you were during the presentation and hit on some of them. One of which is gender balance, which I figured out by that point that you were talking about the integration circles and not the trip. And that's really important. And too, I'll reach out to all the women on the Zoom to say, I encourage you to speak up so we can get a little gender balance in the voices even here, because of course, all the things that you want to do in an integration circle is really what we want to do in life, right? We want to be sensitive to all those things. The soul home is really interesting. Oh, and Larry, I wanted to really thank you for the work that you're doing, just because I come from a real spiritual point of view. So the soul home really speaks to me. And in fact, it reminded me of Eckhart Tolle's, wasn't a psychedelic experience, but he had a sudden, enlightenment moment where he shifted from the old him to the new him. So it can happen with or without drugs. But
yeah, and the quantum change theory is speaking mostly, this was a few times that it was actually applied to ayahuasca and other things, but beforehand it was just a sudden spontaneous experience, and that's what I was trying from. So yeah, it definitely can happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other piece I'll just grab off my notes was the giving suggestions and not advice, which is an awesome, sorry, my neighbors, no, I don't know if you can hear that. That's a good suggestion for life in general. Say, have you considered this, rather than trying to direct it, because I am a guide and I do guiding, but I'm very much like, we're going to go with your intuition and your unfolding. And as talkative as I am, I don't talk nearly as much as a guide, because it's about the other person.
Mm-hmm.
There are more observations, but
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, we're trying to. I mean, there is definitely that sort of balance of like, how both what are we creating here for integration, and also how does this look? Because then after integration, then we do get into implementation. So we're really trying to, do things here that will feel good in other places when people go out to their communities to be able to sort of help their people with integration. There's this sense of like this connection, this balance of energy, this sort of respecting of listening, this non-judgmental space, this opportunity for reflection, just it is kind of trying to like, recreate some of that of what we sort of hope to see in the world, definitely. Which is again, where again, therapeutic model is great, but it is more that one-on-one. I know somebody was asking this earlier, something about individual one-on-one, that type of thing. And I think one-on-one is there's just a different power dynamic, because, you're with that person, you're kind of like having to like talk to that person individually. And it's really good for unpacking deep things, but it's more of a naked raw feel when you have 10 or 11 people in front of you and you don't know how to like describe the experience for that person. You just have to be the experience, and such a different sensation of like, okay, well, I'm going to have to be raw here because I don't really know who's in the room. I don't know. And most people are new. They haven't met each other before. So it really does create this vulnerability. Oh yeah. And I didn't mention that, but really important to ask for confidentiality in the circle, just because there are people there that may not want their names even known that they're at that kind of circle. So we really sort of honor that as well. But yeah, no, I think the whole process is really just kind of a beautiful thing to see. So yeah. There might be questions. Oh, say Carlos. Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest questions that were kind of challenging was like really the sussing out of the information, kind of looking at the differences between, because that was, I mean, through the entire process, from my proposal stage through my dissertation stage, which took way longer than it should have. The simplest thing, what's the difference between transformation and transformative? Oh my goodness, I spent so much time just trying to figure that out, right? What's the difference between integration and implementation? So much time really trying to figure that out. And I'm really happy that I did. But man, I just kind of considered, okay, well, I already know the answer to this, and I realized that I didn't, which is, I guess, part of the process of the dissertation. As far as the defense, I mean, I think they were more asking questions just around sort of the understanding of sort of because I didn't actually present in my dissertation defense the charts that you saw. Those were those are fresh for you guys, or maybe I did, but it's not in my actual dissertation. So they did talk about that a little bit more, to unpack that a little bit more, because that was sort of a new thing that I was putting together. But I think it does a good job of conceptualizing it. And to be honest with you, I did the dissertation defense 3 days before Corona lockdown, so it's all kind of blurry. Everything from here to there is just a little bit fuzzy. But no, it was definitely a great defense, and I had Luis Eduardo Luna, who's a amazing person who works out of Brazil, and he's done a lot of great work in this area. A great facilitator, it has a consciousness center that he sort of studies this and explores with this. Then I had Helge, who's sort of the CIIS person, and Carol. So someone that was interested in Jungian stuff, Jungian thought, and transpersonal experiences. Someone that was really deep into the ayahuasca work, and then somebody that sort of had a sort of a balance of both of those. Yeah, so I kind of blended things. My dissertation was on ayahuasca, and that was kind of where some of the themes were coming up, because otherwise my dissertation would have taken 50 times longer, if I had done, iboga and DMT and everything else. So I just focused on ayahuasca for my dissertation. The actual circles, and so some of those ideas are specific to integration, but I think the qualities of like, did the person feel like they died or not, I think can be relevant across a couple different experiences. Or, was this sort of a unitive mystical experience? We're seeing that with the mushroom research. So I think it crosses some boundaries in terms of the different medicines there. But actually in the circle itself, people are sharing all different types of experiences, sometimes LSD, sometimes ayahuasca, sometimes iboga, sometimes a DMT experience, sometimes a huge mushroom experience, sometimes a really huge mushroom experience. So across the board, but I think that's even sometimes, which has been fascinating, we found people that feel more comfortable coming to an entheogenic integration circle to talk about experiences they felt that they had around alien abductions or things like that they wouldn't actually go and out themselves anywhere else. But here they feel comfortable because already people are sharing really strange experiences. So there's a sense of like, okay, well, I can share this strange experience as well. There's other transpersonal experiences. So the circle is really open in terms of what experiences can come there. And I've always been fascinated by sort of the thematic draw. People that don't know each other will all come to a circle on the same day, and they're all sharing something similar. They're all something that so it's like, what is, it's like, you start to really wonder what is happening here in terms of consciousness in general, as people are coming in and they're all kind of sharing these kind of similar things. So I think, I don't think it needs to be just that person that did that one ayahuasca circle and everyone's then kind of doing that integration, but it helps to have a nice balance of different experiences and different kind of ideas and different perspectives in the circle. And that's what I was sharing about earlier too, about sort of the difference between a one-on-one sort of power dynamic or individual setting versus it being sort of a group setting where people kind of learn together and create meaning together.
Are the slides going to be available?
I could make them available. Yeah, I haven't really thought about it too much, but I could definitely make them available. So if that's the case, I'll maybe contact Jason and then let you go from there. Those 2 slides with all the different stuff on there, I'm still kind of a little hesitant around that because I haven't put them out anywhere specific. So, but maybe it's a good time to start putting them out. That's a good
They're
thing.
the 2 best slides.
Yeah, I know. Thank you. I think Boots has his hand up. Yeah, totally. Sure. Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So I'm part of a church that does ceremonies pretty regularly with, right now we're doing mostly ceremonies with people who are pretty experienced, but I wanted to see what your thoughts were about doing integration in times of difficulty. So we've done quite a few ceremonies during this COVID era. And of course, that has a big impact on, and then also the political situation and things like environmental catastrophes that happen. So it's kind of interesting to help people integrate, not only with regard to their own internal personal experiences, but also with what's going on in the world. So any thoughts about that kind of broader context?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that we actually discuss quite a bit, is like, you know, really trying to suss out, is this our experience or is this the collective experience? Because if you're making meaning of the collective experience, it's going to have different concepts or thoughts or approaches to it than if you're making, you know, your own personal experience. So it's tricky right now because it is a lot of stuff going on right now. All of that is present, you know, sort of the liminal space is available for everybody, almost even without having an experience. So I think that's really, you know, an interesting question, because, you know, where how do you figure out what that boundary is? You know, I mean, we could go and say, oh, we're all one, so it's all us anyway, and okay, that makes sense. But in terms of, we're in a duality system right now, so we have to kind of figure out what's going on. And it, you know, I see a lot of people sometimes feel really have really difficult experiences, but they're like, this doesn't really relate to me at all, but XYZ. And it's like, okay, well, this might be some other thing that you're tapping into. I definitely think that people are having experiences right now. Just have to acknowledge that that's a possibility and sort of sort out what's what. And, you know, we are all of us that are doing these experiences are also healing culture and society and the world and all that kind of thing. You know, we're vomiting for everybody in some of these experiences, you know? So I think that's important, but then in the integration process to really like give space for it. Is this mine or is this something else, you know? Yeah, how do you do it? What is your sort of process in that?
Oh, you probably know about the Santo Daime Church. So it's that context. I'm often a guardian, and so I'm often working with people who are having difficult experiences right during the ceremony, or else then I check in with them in a day or so. But we definitely, like, we had one ceremony like on March 14th, like right before everything locked down, and it was super intense, and we were all surprised at how weird and intense the energy was, and it may very well have been, you know, the global situation manifesting. So,
and have you sort of figured out how to discuss that with people? Have you found a good way for people to sort of figure out what the boundaries were between those two?
Normally the leaders of the ceremony will say something during the ceremony, like to be aware that there's these intense things going on. And we often have a healing circle right at the end of that ceremony when we're still kind of feeling the medicine. So we have a current of healing is what it's called. And we send out our prayers or internal thoughts about healing the world and even healing the leader of our country. Even though we try to keep the place very non-political. Most of us are pretty antagonistic towards our current president, but we send wishes of like, could this person please wake up, you know, and so sometimes that helps. I think people take, and of course there's a really strong connection to the destruction of trees in the Amazon and waters and all that kind of stuff. So we try to acknowledge that in a healing way, basically.
Smart. Yeah. Thank you for the question. That was a good one. Yeah. Something that we definitely have talked about quite a bit, you know, because it is present, you know, and it's good to be aware of that right now. Some people are totally like, oh, I don't know why I had this really difficult experience. Like, hey, well, you know, 2020, welcome. Is there any other questions?
Hey, yeah, well, I guess mine was like kind of rhetoric in a way, but it was a comment towards, you know, what Max kind of, his questions I thought were really thoughtful and kind of along the same line of thinking that I was kind of like going in. So I appreciate that, Max, also. But my question was more along the line of like, how does intuition kind of fit into the scope of what you're learning through integration or the process of integration? Because I feel like intuition is kind of like a part of this spiritual evolution, and really defining what that means from a molecular, you know, standpoint through science, and also through a, you know, that whole aspect of science being, you know, what is physical and spiritual is what's kind of religious, and without a religious context in this realm of what we're doing here, because it doesn't fit within like the old molds, but definitely with an ancestral like aspect outside of like Christianity. I was just kind of curious what your thoughts were on how intuition kind of fits into the growth of what we're developing here or as a group.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love thinking about these ideas of like intuition, because you really start to have to think about like, what is intuition exactly? Intuition is a sense or a feeling of the way something is going to go in the future, or the way something is. So it's like almost like this timeless moment, right? You're able to sort of access some like future kind of understanding and kind of be in the present. And that's how I'm kind of viewing intuition when I look at that. And you really see that in the circles. Like that's what I was saying, where like, to trust the process, to realize that the people that are coming to these circles are drawing from their own experiences. Like we're all speaking with the plants when we're in these circles. And I think intuition really draws from that. And then somebody will have this reflection from their experience, or someone will intuit, you know, for example, we had one experience that I can remember a while ago, which is kind of funny. This is how you don't want to implement all of a sudden, or before you're ready to fully make sense of it. This gentleman came in, and I won't say his name, and just kind of leave it vague in terms of the experience, just as an example here. He came in and he spoke about, I had this vision that I'm supposed to have a baby with this beautiful woman, and I just met her. I don't really know her that well, and because of the timing of things and the stars, I need to have this baby by Wednesday, right? And everyone's like, oh, it's Sunday. That's 3 days. You got a lot of work to do, right? But everyone in the circle picked up on it. There was sort of this intuitive sense of like, okay, this person's working with a really deep experience, and how can we talk about it in a way that is sort of not really judgmental, but at least can help him sort of reflect on it a little deeper, so he doesn't go and do something, you know, tragic or whatever, right? So, you know, for example, I was talking about different timelines. Was it possible it was on this timeline, or maybe you're reviewing another timeline, or how does this, you know, so, and other people were having good reflection, but everyone kind of picked up on it intuitively, and were able to help the person discuss it in a way that gave them some space to think, okay, well, maybe I need to think about this a little bit more. And I think that's been really beautiful. So I think intuition in the circles is really important in terms of how things sort of develop. You sort of see that sort of group intuition that kicks in. In terms of intuition, in terms of how to integrate, I think that's probably a natural quality of like, at least the folks that are doing this work. I think I personally believe that everyone that's doing this medicine work has a deeper sense of intuition, maybe because you can feel a little better. You know, intuition also is like when you have good intuition, then synchronicities and coincidences just kind of fall in place in front of you, you know, because you're kind of paying attention more. So intuition is also paying attention to the feelings, to the senses, all that kind of thing. I'd be curious to hear kind of your thoughts around what intuition is, but I think it's really interesting conversation in terms of as we're dealing with these transpersonal spaces above and beyond us, how we're able to sort of feel into that a little bit more, which gives us a knowing that's almost sort of ahead of us, if you will, you know.
Definitely. I feel like intuition for me is like a collection of experience, you know, that we tap into, and they help us navigate through survival, which is, you know, the purpose of existence is surviving, right? So it's either like the kind of the, what Max was like pointing out was like nature versus nurture, right? And what you learn through nurturing versus what's inherited. So that would be like an epigenetic kind of like passed through aspect of learning, right? So we have stuff that's embedded in us, and then that we can tap into or unblock to reach. And I think the integrative process really helps unleash that intuitive aspect. So if we think of our brain as being this neuroplastic structure, when we increase those neuron firings, or increasing the ability to strengthen that muscle of intuition. Mm-hmm. And that's a beautiful aspect of what we're doing here. And that's kind of like my senses on it. But I think there's a huge difference between what is nature and what is nurture, what's inherited, what's passed down, and how we tap into it. And I think the more studies that we have going into the science aspect, we can kind of see those bridging gaps of how intuition actually has a science behind it, more than just a feeling, because a feeling is a sensation. Mm-hmm. So if there's a sensation, there's got to be a rhyme and reason behind the phenomenon.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the idea of epigenetics is really a fascinating thing, because I don't know if you remember, at least when I went to high school and middle school, when we talk about epigenetics, everyone's like, oh, that's kind of Lamarckian, right? You know, you can't switch on and switch off sort of genetics. It doesn't work, you know, and it was kind of like poo-pooed, at least when I was younger. So it's now nice to see, oh, wait, this is actually a conversation again. We can actually actively turn things on and off and actually engage with this process of learning what our ancestors learned, which is all in our genetic code. It's all, that's a history of our ancestors, right? So really speak to where our ancestors are coming from. And that's where the intuition comes in too, because not even just, you know, that is maybe the collective you're speaking about. You're learning all the lessons from all the generations before you that are sort of embedded in your gene structure. I think epigenetics is a really fascinating conversation. I know Jota Ford does a lot of work with that, and a couple other folks, but I think it's really interesting in terms of how this looks in the future, or how we sort of understand our being and our genetics and all that other kind of thing. Yeah, we have so much to learn. It's just really great to be at sort of the ground level of what seems to be, you know, an infinite amount of space in front of us, you know.
Definitely. Well, thanks for tackling some of those philosophical questions.
Yeah.
Tailing on that, it also, from my perspective anyway, overlaps questions of past and future lives, and their connection to our present and the intuition that we have now. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that came up in the research as well. There's quite a few experiences of tapping into past lives. You know what I mean? And that's the thing, is like when you kind of dive into these questions, like, technically all time is happening right now, so shouldn't be hard to tap into that, because you just gotta, you know, just go like there. It's right, it's happening right here, it's all happening right here, right? It's all happening at the now moment. So so that makes sense. But again, it's like, it really start talking about sort of psi experiences. Now you're talking about telepathy, you're talking about what the mind can do outside, paranormal type things that are kind of super taboo in terms of the science literature right now. You know, we don't talk about that at all, but could be one of the most interesting things about some of this research is that opportunity, that ability. You know, I mean, I'm sure you know, ayahuasca used to be called telepathine because they thought there was a telepathic ability that people had, and they changed that name. But yeah, no, I think that's again, as we move forward and kind of get through this, okay, it's just for depression or anxiety, we can be like, oh wow, it's actually for consciousness and learning and, you know, sharing ideas and thoughts without having to do it through a phone or anything else. We can just, you know, I can do this talk just by imagining it to you all, you know. So I think that's really exciting, because again, everything we know is potentially can get upturned, and so that's why these paradigms are important, because we're moving into a new paradigm. So why keep getting it assimilated into this previous paradigm?
multi-dimensional reality.
For sure. I think I don't know if he stepped off. Yeah, he gave some props, I think. Huh? Lazola, yep. Can I ask a question for the people that do you think that you have a different understanding of integration now than you had when you started this? And maybe put a thumbs up if that's true, and if it's about the same, maybe if you have these reactions, the hand clap will be the same, the thumbs up is a different understanding. Great. Great, awesome. Well, it's still developing. That's the beautiful thing about it. So hopefully we'll continue to learn more about what integration is. So. There maybe, yeah. Yeah.
I did want to say, yeah, it is awesome research. And for people that like research, it's just amazing. And I did learn and I do enjoy it. And yet I did want to make that comment of if the soul home piece is right and that's the real world and this is just an illusion, it's interesting you know, I want to thank you specifically, and I guess the whole community, for the work that we're doing by allowing people to really awaken, because it, you know, it's every year we always seem to say, well, it's just such a crazy year, it's so much whatever, and 2020 is just so much more above anything any of us have ever seen in our lifetimes.
Yeah,
And when you consider that, yeah, the psychedelic renaissance revolution awakening is happening at the same time, this may be the most important work that's going on. And I guess I'll share a short anecdote or thing that recently happened to me. I'm a big present moment, live in the now kind of person, and I apparently was not in the now when I was crossing the street. I was out installing yard signs for Sarah Iannarone for mayor of Portland. Woohoo!
yeah.
And I got distracted. I was not in my body paying attention, and I twisted my ankle so severely and fell on the pavement, and but my reaction to it is, it reminds me that I was not in the moment at that time, and it's slowing me down. It's like, it's time to slow down and just, you know, the universe will give you what you need. And I credit, to wrap that in, to have it make sense, I credit my use of psychedelics as being something that really helps me integrate everything. And two, some people might have, you know, sprained their ankle and just been really upset. Oh, it hurts, and I can't get it. I live up all these steps. My house has so many steps down to my car. You know, I'm not at all there. I'm just, you know, looking at, you know, the benefits of it. So.
Yeah, definitely. No, that for me too. You know, there's so many things that I just take as just a different view on things in terms of like negative experiences, or, you know, things that were challenging. You know, I kind of like, okay, what am I learning from this? And you definitely get that, I think, from my experiences as well. You know, where it's like, oh wow, okay, I've gone through some really crazy stuff in those experiences and found out there's certain ways or certain insights that help me with that, or homework assignments I have, those types of things. So yeah, and I think it's this whole soul home idea thing is so interesting, because then it's like, are the plants working with us? Are we having, you know, they're here to help us do this thing, you know? So it really sort of speaks to even now this homework assignment idea. And I'll tell this little brief story here, but one time I was doing ayahuasca and I had these homework assignments that came, you know, and it's like how important it is to do your homework assignments and there's like the implementations, right? Sometimes you don't even have insights that need to happen. It's like, you need to do this thing, and this thing, right? So for me, it was like, I need to, you know, heal some relationships with family members and do these other things, blah, blah, blah. I had this sort of insight. I was living in Hawaii at the time, went about 3 or 4 months. This person who comes usually was calling once every month or maybe twice a month to have ceremony. And so I was waiting 2-3 months go by. I was like, oh, I haven't heard from this. I hope he's okay. 4 months, 5 months, 6 months go by, 7 months go by. I was like, oh man, I hope he's all right. I know he's flying from California back and forth. Hope everything's okay. Around the 8th month, I finished the first homework assignment and reminded me like, oh, that's right. I had these homework assignments, because it's really easy to like, after your afterglow's done, like, those are too hard. I'm not going to do those. Right. But ayahuasca's like, you better do those. I'm not going to come until you come back. Right. Finally do the second homework assignment. Okay. I'm bumping now. Okay. Let's get this last one done. Do the last homework assignment. It involved, you know, healing some relationships with some family members. I went up to Haleakala, which is this beautiful crater up in Maui. We did some nice healing. You know, we weren't able to heal everything, but we were able to really make some nice connections. I drove him to the airport, 12 o'clock the next day, got home at 12:30, 12:31, 1 year after I had the homework assignments, and literally a minute after my last homework assignment was done, ring, ring, hey, we're doing an ayahuasca ceremony this weekend. You want to come? Like, are you kidding me right now? So what's happening there? You know, okay, sure, that's just a coincidence. That's an easy way to say that. But it was something else. It was like, there's this whole process involved, and I was being intentional through it. I was learning things through it and like going through my process. So, you know, it speaks to this, like, okay, if we do have the soul home, if the plants are working for us, how important it is to tap into what they want us to do and not just have this as a recreational thing or something that we just kind of blow off, these types of things, because it's trying to help us heal so that we can go to these places and back to our soul home, I think. So yeah, really interesting question. I'd love to maybe explore the soul home with you at some point. Anyone else too? Let's have a whole just dialogue, a round table on what the soul home is. I think that'd be really just interesting. Right.
Well, I'd like to put my theory in there on the soul home.
Sure.
Okay, so my theory is on the soul home, and I think you're all tracking on the right way too. I think the soul home is the center of the galaxy, and I think our existence, our consciousness actually exists there, and that we're like sock puppets on this earth, and we are connecting in that world. But in this world is where our physical existence is, but in that world is where we actually exist. That's my own personal opinion on that. And getting back to what Sarah was saying about intuition, and since I've got the mic, intuition, man, that's kind of how I'm integrating mushrooms also. I use shrooms kind of in a different way, so I don't want to go down that track, but I do use shrooms, and it does help me with my intuition. And I've used this in a practical sense in my job. I'm not working anymore. I was working for Nabisco making cookies and crackers, but I used intuition as my guide for operating the ovens, and they have very structured ways of doing things. But I went completely off the track. I was like that Yoda guy, meditating all the time at work, and my ovens would run perfectly. But I was doing it all by intuition and breaking the rules that they had been doing for years. And so I think I can attribute some of that to shrooms, and not just shrooms. I use them all, to be honest. I think they're all beneficial and they all help in certain respects. And I've used ayahuasca and I've used them all. And I've had good experiences for pretty much all of them, except for iboga. That's the one that that one never really helped for me. But the other ones were great. But anyway, I just wanted to get back to that intuition and just shout at that. I think that's where we're headed. That's where I'm headed anyway. That's how I see it. And through shrooms, not really through shrooms. I don't get a religion from shrooms. Shrooms for me just basically connect me, make me connected. And can I be really blunt and honest with you and tell you that shrooms for me, and this is going to be kind of, shrooms for me is like, it's like a condom. Okay. It's like I can stay in this place of spiritual ecstasy and this presence with the divine for much longer when I'm on shrooms than when I'm not on shrooms. So I can get there without being on shrooms. You don't have to be on shrooms to be there. But shrooms is like, it helps me stay in that place without quite, I'm right below that threshold, you know what I mean? And that's what it's like for me. And that's how I personally use it. And so I know that's completely different from the way a lot of other people use it, but that's how I use shrooms. The other drugs are different things. But anyway, I don't want to, sorry, I went off track. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I unfortunately didn't have my integration brain on, but I think there was. I mean, obviously, some of the things there we're talking about, how sort of engaging with the mushroom, because this is slightly different integration, because this is integration with work, this is integration with experience. So this is integration that it sounds like you've had a lot of experiences. So there's this idea of the inoculation effect, right? If you've had a mystical experience the first time, wow, that was super transformative. The 10th time, maybe not so much. The 20th time, now you're doing the work. Now you're creating these ideas around like, okay, what does it mean when I'm engaging in these different places? What does it mean when I'm searching this place of consciousness? What does it mean when we're the center of the universe? And this is, you're kind of like diving deeper into those questions that were initially transformative. So that would be kind of where I would explore, is kind of maybe some of the deeper questions, or the existential ideas or spiritual ideas that you're speaking about, because it sounds where the juice is for you. It's where it's really kind of interesting for you.
In my case, I'd have to backtrack a little bit and say that it's really intentional for me, and that I've had these really strong spiritual experiences from since childhood. So it's kind of like, okay, oh, here's drugs. Okay, that does help me aid in a spiritual experience. But I wouldn't go back and say that it happened because I had drugs at this one time and then it happened. But I look at them now, like in a practical sense, I look at them like they're like training wheels for people that can use what I've known, people that I know that are use them for like a meditation thing, where they get in that place where they feel that oneness, that peace thing, and that's a hard place to get into. It takes years for some of these people, these Hindu guys, to get into it, but they can get into it in a couple hours in these states of places that are very similar to it. And so it's kind of like that. I kind of look at that, but I came from a different direction a little bit on that. So so anyway, but that's where I would be coming from.
And thank you, appreciate it.
Do you mind if I piggyback on that a little bit and just say thank you, Jerry, for like sharing. I really liked your perspective and your analogy. But I feel like mushroom site can relate to that aspect of like how it really does bring me into a moment of awareness. You know, a lot of people have that, it's kind of a shared known that, you know, we see more vibrantly, we hear, we feel, we sense at a much more intensified scale. And it really makes us tap into the moment that we're having right then. We're not experiencing our brain going into the past, thinking about what we did or didn't get done. And we're not like focusing in the future about the things that we have on our list to get done. We're really in that moment of experiencing present time. And I think that that's where the intuitive aspect kind of works for me on what our brain stores as a collective experience of intuition is those moments of awareness. It stores in our gray matter, in our memory, different than other experiences do. And so that over time, that intuitive muscle of storing those moments of awareness becomes stronger. And so I do feel like me personally, mushrooms really has helped that kind of strength and growth of intuitive like memory database, like in my own head storing.
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, like I said, my theory is that we're already connected in that other universe, on that other side of the dark hole. That's where we are. And every time I feel like I'm going into that place, it feels like that. It feels like I'm being pulled into it. But it feels like gloves, really. But it feels like that's, and so tapping into that, for me, it's like I'm tapping into a knowledge base that's always there. And it's not just, I didn't just use it at work for figuring out how to use these ovens. I use it for a lot of other things, you know, astrology. I've got my own way of doing astrology that's completely off the book, but it's working for me. And it's because I've learned it through intuition. It's like things that I do kind of hammer out, not on the drugs itself, but it's things, but the drugs do kind of bring you into that intuitive place. I mean, they just bring you into that place where when you can turn off your mind just a little bit, and you can shut it off, and they take forever to learn it with the Hindu practice or whatever. But when you can shut your mind off, it comes that dark, that place of peace, you know, God, that's when we can get that knowledge. And then for me, it becomes a place of putting on ears, and I'm not just listening to silence. Sometimes I'm swapping thoughts like photographs, like the intuition to me, it's not words blasting in my ears, but they're exchanging thoughts. But at the same time, the physical presence of this divine presence is swirling all over my body, and speaking in volumes, just in the way that it does this. And this happens with whether I'm on it's kind of funny, no matter what drug I'm on, it's always the same result. Even ayahuasca, I came into this deep presence, and it was always there. So that's when you're going into that place, that dark. I'm probably going too long here. I'm sorry if I am. Cut me off if I am. Just shut off the mic. You know, but if you go into this deep dark hole, you're connecting there. I mean, that's, and then from there, I'm tuning to a divine source, and now through this habit of mine, it's been a lifelong habit of mine of tuning into this divine source. And even way back when I was 17, this divine source was in me and helped me escape from prison. And it's a true story. I escaped from prison, and I was escaped for 12 years, escaped from adult prison. I had a really hard life, but I escaped from adult prison. I was free for 12 years. But this divine source, it's been like a romance ever since. And I know this is way off track from where we started on this. I know, but see, here's what I'm telling you, and that's where I got back to how do I use it? Well, okay, that gets back to my quantum analogy, and it's because I can get into these places without the drugs. But when I'm not using the drugs, I got to take breaks. I got to get in the shower sometimes and watch TV. Seriously, it's very strong. And it's
I would,
beautiful.
real quick question maybe for you or for Sari as well is like, I noticed you're talking a lot about intuition, but you haven't really mentioned too much about plant teachers or teacher, you know, I guess plant teacher is kind of a Western term, but plants that offer knowledge. How do you sort of separate the two between, oh, this is my intuition, or maybe you don't believe that the consciousness of the plants is there, but like, do you ever think about that? Like, is it coming from you? How much of your intuition is maybe from external, wiser sort of plant being or mushroom being? Is this something you're thinking about in terms of how you look at it? I know you're talking about intuition being in the gray matter, but like, you know, if we're in consciousness and we're embedded in that, does intuition exist out here too, or somewhere else?
You want to share? I can just talk.
Yeah, go ahead, Jerry, and I'll go after.
Okay. Well, for me, the ayahuasca was very powerful because for me, that was the teacher. And I use ayahuasca and I also use DMT. And ayahuasca for me was, I went for 3 ceremonies in Costa Rica, spread out over a week. And each ceremony was basically along the same themes. And it was the same teacher, basically along the same ones. It was with me, all 3 of them. And it was really powerful. And to go down and tell you of all the details of everything that happened, everything would just take way too long. But I do look at that as separate. And they were separate teachers. And in this particular case, in ayahuasca case, the entity actually lived inside of me, came inside of me. And he was like just briefly, he was an Indian warrior. And so he was living as if he hadn't been able to live for many years, for centuries, ages. And he felt that he wanted me to go outside so he could feel the dirt between his toes. And he wanted to see the outside. And I communed with this old Indian chief, or this warrior guy. He was there in the first trip, and he was there through all 3 trips. And he was with me, kind of a sidekick and kind of a companion. And he did these really cool things. I hope I'm not going too far off, but he did this thing where with his fingers, where he would feel on my body, and he was feeling my back, and he was feeling all over my body, and he pinched my stomach and said, "Oh, you're too fat." And he was trying to feel how I was. And you may not believe this, but he felt my back. He did some work on my back, and I had a lower disc. I still have a lower disc problem. It's totally disintegrated, but I used to have back problem. I don't have them now. I haven't had them since that ayahuasca ceremony 3 years ago, and over in my rotator arms. And I'm not saying I'm healed, but I'm saying the thing is, it did make a change. So in that situation, yeah, I felt a teacher. In certain drugs, DMT, I felt a teacher. I get a lesson sometimes with DMT, and DMT is a great teacher. Even the 15-minute thing, I'll get something out of that. But they're all basically the same thing. And weed is kind of like, weed brings me into the presence of the teacher. And I feel it brings me into a teacher, a physical presence. And that's when I'm exchanging these thoughts, these knowledge, this intuition, where it's an active thing. So the drug does help me in that way. It's not necessary, but in some of them, the teacher is obvious. In other ones, it's really not. But anyway, sorry. Oh, sorry.
I'll make it quick. For me, it's as simple as like, you know, I'm an artist, so how I express choosing my medium is going to be a different intention depending on the medium. So for plants, it's really about that set and setting and really going in with the intention of knowing what I want to get out of the session, the healing, the journey. And so different plant medicines have different offerings in different avenues. And so it's really about deciding what I'm working on or what I'm open to understanding. And I think that for me, you know, I've done my share of journeys and done my share of using a variety of different psychedelics. And so I think over time you work with the right people, or you build the understanding of you knowing these affirmations. So I get, or confirmations. I get confirmations through the lessons, through the integration process. And I think that it's really important to honor that by recognizing it. And the more that you recognize the lesson coming to fruition in that unfolding, I think that that's part of the intuitive aspect is learning how to work with the plants and building that relationship with the medicine. And that's, I don't even know how to like contextualize that in words, but I hope that you understand what I'm saying in the sense of like, when you choose to do this work, you're not just doing it with an integrative person that can help you necessarily as much as you are doing it for yourself. And so listening to how to use those plants and how to listen to that feedback through the medicine is just as imperative of getting that person to sit with you and help you integrate the experience yourself, is knowing intuitively how to listen as well. So yeah, that's kind of my take on it.
I don't disagree with that at all, definitely. And I think that's, again, sort of the point here is like, you know, really this chart can be used for yourself. It can be used for, you know, an individual, but really just sort of opening up to the idea of like, hey, you know, the plant is also teaching us, and there's different relationships that are happening there. And that's where the integration can happen as well. But, you know, it's really nice to be in community, I think, for a lot of folks, and really just kind of like feel seen and heard, especially when some of these experiences, like nobody has heard them at all ever, you know. And so just to be able to like share that, there's this idea, I think, secondary revisionism or something, like when you say it, you can hear it again with your own voice, and there like helps you reshape what you're thinking about. So, so yeah, I'm in total agreement with that. It's like there's this process, you're in the relationship integrating with the plants, you're in a relationship integrating with community and yourself. So yeah, it's a really big, big area here. It's been a really great conversation afterwards, by the way. So thank you all. It's been nice.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. I want to say thank you, everybody. I have to go use the restroom, and so maybe time to drink a little water and go use the restroom, everything. But it's been really a pleasure. It's what a great community you all have there. Like, I really enjoy these fantastic questions afterwards. You know, people that have been really thinking about them themselves for a really long time, and you can tell. You know, it's not just like, oh, I have this idea, but like really in-depth questions. So I really appreciate that, because I dumped a lot of theory on you. So I see that it was well received, and that everyone's also thinking about these things. So that's exciting for the future of this as well. So thank you, everybody. Really an honor to be here, and I look forward to maybe coming back and talking about the soul home with everybody at some point in time in the future. Perfect. Sounds good. Sounds good. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.